obviously, if the government has been involved in making it collapse, potentially laying open MPs to be spied upon by the Chinese state.
Is the opportunity of doing more trade with China and it being an engine of economic growth for the UK outweigh the kind of significance of bringing two people to justice who allegedly spied for China? It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And there are facts and there's finger pointing. And at the moment, there seems to be a lot more finger pointing than there are facts. The facts are that Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry were charged under the Official Secrets Act of spying for China when they were working in Parliament. And one of them was a parliamentary assistant, and they had access to Parliament. And suddenly the charges got dropped last month. Since when the government has pointed the finger at the previous Conservative government. The Conservative government has pointed it at the present government. The government has then pointed it at the Deputy National Security Advisor. And others have pointed the finger at Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor to the government. And some people in the Labour Party very high up, cabinet ministers, have called for his resignation. There is a lot of murk and there's a lot of unpicking that needs to be done.
Yeah, look, the reason that this is becoming a political problem for the government and why the opposition parties in particular are crying foul about it is because it is so opaque as to why the trial collapsed. The accusation has come forth that the government in some way interfered with it because they wanted to protect relations with Beijing. So last week, and this is what has prompted the CPS, who obviously initially brought this case to trial, all of this finger-pointing prompted the head of the CPS, Director of Public Prosecution, of course, one of Keir Starmer's successors in that job, said that the case collapsed because evidence could not be obtained from the government referring to China as a national security threat. This is very rare for the DPP to do this. He said that the CPS, his organisation, has tried to obtain further evidence from the government over many months, but witness statements did not meet the threshold to prosecute. The government is saying, and we can talk about why some of this is a little bit flimsy, the government is blaming Rishi Sunak's government for not designating China as a national security threat at the time that these allegations took place. Many independent commentators are saying that actually that does not matter. And the reason this goes to the heart of Downing Street in particular is for the reason that John was saying, which is the accusation is being made that Jonathan Powell, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, used to work for Tony Blair, may have been involved in some way. Indeed, when I asked explicitly about that to Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, at the weekend as to whether he had any involvement, see if you can make any sense of what she said. Can you give us your assurance that the Prime Minister, and no one who works for the Prime Minister, and in this you'll know I'm referring to his National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, were in any way involved with this decision?
I can give you the assurance that the National Security Advisor was not involved in discussions about the substance of the case or about the evidence connected to the case, yes.
Was he involved in any way?
No, he was not involved in this case, either on the substance or the evidence. I can give you that assurance.
He was not consulted. He didn't give his view about any of it at any point.
Well, I'm sure he has opinions on lots of topics.
No, but he wasn't consulted and he didn't give a view.
He was not involved in the evidence or in the taking forward of this case. He was not involved in the substance of it. It is deeply frustrating, deeply disappointing.
What does it mean that he wasn't involved in the substance? What do you mean by that?
He was not involved in the substance of this case in material considerations, including considerations in relation to the evidence. I'm trying to be as clear as I possibly can that this is fundamentally a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service. And yes, we are frustrated too that the cases were not taken forward.
Really reminded me of Brandon Lewis when he tried to describe the way that the law would be broken over the Northern Ireland Agreement during the Brexit negotiations. Do you remember? And he said, in a limited and specific way. When people land on two adjectives that they rehearse over and over again, all that you're thinking as you're listening is, what are you really trying not to say? Right? She'd clearly landed on those two adjectives over and over again as a way round what was a very complicated, sort of unnecessarily complicated answer.
Well, I suppose those were her 2 points, that are the talking points. You're briefed before you do the interview and say, right, evidence or substance. He wasn't involved in presenting the evidence or the substance. I think what it's trying to say is that he had been involved, and this is what we've subsequently learned, that he was involved in a meeting about, China-UK relations and what would be the fallout from it. Now, is that a distinction without a difference? Or is that kind of a difference, that he wasn't involved in the preparation? Downing Street are absolutely kind of, circling the wagons around Jonathan Powell and saying it was nothing to do with him that this case collapsed. But you then look at this evidence about the 1911 Official Secrets Act and whether you can only prosecute somebody if they have been designated, the state, if you've been spying for a state that is designated as a threat to national security. And again, that seems to be the argument that Keir Starmer is falling back on, when if you look at apparently the case law and the detail of the Act, it doesn't really say that.
I think the thing that is confusing people about this is that, this can get quite technical about the Official Secrets Act of 1911, the fact that that was superseded by the National Security Act of 2023. And the government is saying that that old act was out of date and therefore this is all just a bit of a bureaucratic problem. But a lot of legal scholars who are looking at this basically say that that is pretty rum. Because under even the old act, basically, if you're spying for a state, irrespective of whether the government has officially designated a national security threat, you are spying for a state. And we should say these gentlemen involved deny these allegations, but you are spying for a state. And a lot of the people who are experts in this legal architecture, therefore, don't understand what the government is really saying. And the reason this kind of matters as well is it's not just a kind of relatively kind of, obscure thing or whatever. Look at what Lindsay Hoyle has said about it, the Speaker of the Commons. He's basically said that the collapse of this case, and obviously if the government has been involved in making it collapse, that makes what he's about to say even worse. He said that this is, as far as he's concerned, potentially laying open MPs to be spied upon by the Chinese state or other state actors, and the people involved potentially face no legal recourse, or at the very least, that is potentially the message that has been sent out with the collapse of this trial. It's serious stuff.
I've been talking to people who work in this wheelhouse, who have real questions about what went on here. Senior lawyers, barristers, prosecutors. And one senior lawyer said, look, the impression I have whenever you get into a mess like this is the interesting thing is to ask how the mess occurred. And they explain the big question that they still have. So whenever you bring a prosecution, there is a CPS code test. In other words, you need to know if it's met the threshold. It has to satisfy the code of prosecutors. The first question you ask is there evidential basis? But the second question you can ask, and you can ask them in either order, is whether it's in the public interest. And this person said, look, the government could have easily got rid of this. It is a very usual thing. The government, any government, can easily get rid of an awkward prosecution, effectively giving immunity to Secret Service personnel by saying it's not in the public interest. It's how you get rid of prosecutions which no longer suit the government of the day. But they didn't do that. They went down the evidential code test instead. And this lawyer said it just makes no sense, because if you gather the evidence that brings the case to a charge, which they did in April of 2024, that evidence doesn't change. You might want to get further evidence, you might want to expand the evidence, but you can't then go back and say, well, actually, unless something material has happened, which in this case it hasn't, that evidence still stands.
That's the key. Sorry to interrupt. Just to make it clear for people. That's the key point of why one of the fundamental things the government is saying makes no sense. Because what they're saying is that, the legal architecture wasn't working. If that were the case, the CPS would never have brought it in the first place.
And at that point, you then turn it over to a jury, right? What you're saying is this is the evidence in front of you. Let the jury decide. Let the jury make their decision. But this person said to me, as I say, a sort of a legal scholar said, it is quite normal for a government to make these cases go away by asking the questions if it's in the public interest. And this person thinks that it rests with Foreign Office, it rests with the Attorney General. Somebody got to this and they forgot to ask that main question. And this person said, why don't you go and you put that question to the CPS, you put it to the Director of Prosecutions, and we did. We put that question, why did this never go to a question of public interest, to the Director of Public Prosecutions, their press office, and they got back and said, we won't be commenting further at that time, this is all we've had to say. In other words, there is no response to that makes any real sense.
So let's just broaden this out further to try to kind of put this in a context, which is that this government, indeed the last government as well, thought that China poses a national security threat on various different fronts, but also China represents an economic opportunity. And so, does the one thing lead to the other? Is the opportunity of doing more trade with China and it being an engine of economic growth for the UK outweigh the kind of significance of bringing two people to justice who allegedly spied for China? Now, the case is being, people are arguing, well, it's clear the economic importance is taking priority over this legal case. And that is why, allegedly, the government have scuppered the case. And that is the context in which you have to say, well, hang on, surely if you've got two people who have been spying for another country that pose a national security threat, and they have been spying in Parliament on MPs, then surely that has to go to trial. And maybe it doesn't because, well, the economic imperative is greater.
The other point to that, funnily enough, is, and this goes back to this idea that the CPS were told to get rid of the case on an evidential basis. The Director of Public Prosecutions called this a High Court case, right? If you go back to the transcription, the press releases, he calls it a High Court case. It wasn't. It was a Court of Appeal case. Now, if you're the Director of Prosecutions, Public Prosecutions, you don't get stuff like that wrong. We might miss it. We might get the details wrong. But you don't get that wrong. And this person said it's such a basic howler. It suggests it wasn't thought through. In other words, it is a mess. They've got themselves into a mess because they reacted in the wrong way to something that they thought they had to clear up.
And the other element to this is, of course, is that this stuff is being noticed. I mean, the Sunday Times had a quote, albeit from an anonymous White House official, basically saying that the Trump administration had very much noticed this stuff and were very concerned about it. And we're concerned, I mean, we know, obviously, the sort of, geopolitical tension there is between the US and China predates Trump, it's intensified under Trump. But it's not just this. There's also this question of the Chinese mega embassy, which lots of people think is basically a kind
which would have been decided today. I mean, they've just pushed that decision back. But we were waiting to hear whether this absolutely huge, vast complex in the centre of London would have got greenlit by the Labour government.
And lots of people think that is basically just a massive sort of, espionage centre, or has the ability to sort of become so, and it's sort of controversial. And so, as ever, this is, Starmer and Reeves have tried to thaw relations with Beijing, and because, John, as you say, the economic opportunities which they think are there, as ever with British governments, and we saw this with the Huawei decision under the Theresa May government, lots of British governments want to get close to China, and geopolitical realities, mainly from the United States, often bounce them back. But I do think, in this era that we're living in, I mean, let's remember, Chinese have been involved, MI5 and MI6 have warned that, the Chinese have been involved in all sorts of sort of cyber attacks against the UK, cyber terrorism against the UK, lots of accusations of them trying to spy on MPs. This is a problem which is apparently getting worse. The government's accusation that the last government didn't designate them as a national security threat is pretty risible when you consider that Rishi Sunak literally talked in explicit terms of China being a major geopolitical threat.
Why did you bring the charge then anyway?
Yeah, well, quite so. So all of that. So it feels to me that the holding position that the government and Starmer has got is becoming increasingly difficult. It's a nebulous position. They're trying to confuse everybody, or that's certainly the net effect anyway. How much road that has to run when... I know for a fact there are lots of Labour-owned MPs who are always nervous about this cozying up to China and how it could be used against them politically, if nothing else. All of these questions are now coming into the harsh light of public debate.
I mean, the enemy thing is really interesting because the actual definition is whether it is information useful to an enemy. Now, look, you can go down the stuff that those two men are alleged to have sent, and it's pretty hard to even see why it might have been useful to an enemy. But if you send information to Canada or Australia. They might not be enemies, right? They're not enemies of the British state, but they can pass it on, right? If somebody is spying for you, it can still get into enemy hands. It can still be passed on to an enemy. So this whole idea of the designation, as you say, makes absolutely no sense in any realistic test.
Look, MI6 doesn't only have spies in Russia and China.
Yeah.
MI6 has spies in Paris,
Exactly.
in Rome, in Washington. Of course, the MI6 station chief we have MI6 station chiefs.
We just call them ears.
Well, yeah, and they're trying to find out what's going on in the country, and they're getting all sorts of information from those sort of people. Lewis, you said something about, the government is sort of trying to muddy the waters, and it's kind of, sowing confusion. I was speaking to someone at the weekend from, within government, who was saying, look, the fact of the matter is that we don't believe there is a bit of a mess, but we don't believe that anyone's that interested in this as a subject, that this is not getting traction with the public, because they may listen to podcasts like this and think, oh my God, I'm going to scratch my head. This is too complicated. I don't quite get it. Does it matter that much? It's not a clear-cut, obvious case where you can say, oh my God, look, there is wrongdoing there. This, heads must roll. At the moment, it's the kind of, what dare I say, the classic BBC thing where a deputy head will roll. It seems like the Deputy National Security Advisor is being lined up to be the fall guy in all
Well,
of
it
this.
depends, of course, what they've said to Parliament and what they've said less seriously, but nonetheless potentially politically damaging, what Starmer and others have said to in public. And these things obviously can start off feeling a little bit obscure or recondite and then slowly kind of build up over time. And that's where it feels like it is. Put it this way, the press, much of the press, has got a sort of bit between the teeth on this now. You can see it in the Sunday Times, the Mail, others. They sense the Conservative Party, they sense that there's something here, and you can just feel it starting to build up.
I mean, what's really interesting is the pendulum swing about governments and China, right? If you go back to Cameron and Osborne, I mean, the number of Chinese banquets they sat through because they were basically saying, we're going to go out, love China, do business with China. We want Huawei. I remember going around the Huawei factory with George Osborne. It was a big deal. And then under Theresa May, and you remember Gavin Williamson was actually fired from the May government because he said, actually, Huawei is a threat. And she said he'd leaked that and, come from sort of internal meetings. But you see this pattern, which is we get very, very close and then the subsequent government goes completely against it. Then you get somebody like Liz Truss, right, who, for all her faults, was an absolute China hawk, right, called out China. And then suddenly you're back in this place of like, well, we've got too many other enemies now and there's too little trade coming in from elsewhere. And, we haven't got any kind of EU deal that makes us, rich or trade works, so let's get back into China's pockets again. I mean, it's the same thing. We just go round in circles.
There was a famous occasion when President Xi came to London and David Cameron was the Prime Minister. And they were going to
Took
do a
him
trip.
to the pub, didn't they?
Well, they did a trip to Manchester City Football Club. And there was absolute strict instructions about what you had to do and where President Xi would stand. And the Chinese Secret Service absolutely tight about what could be done and what couldn't be done. And Sergio Aguero, the forward for Manchester City, suddenly produces his phone and says, come on, let's do a selfie. And so there's a selfie with President Xi, David Cameron and Sergio Aguero. And it was considered the most brilliant diplomatic triumph of the trip that this selfie had come out and made them look really good and human.
It's worth saying as well that, Ollie Robbins, who is the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office, is in China this week, meeting with Chinese officials on long-planned business, as has been said, while all of this is going on. Starmer himself is supposed to be visiting next year. So this is, this is part of a concerted effort which has been taking place since this government came to office. And let's leave aside some of the political considerations about how they might, questions they might be asked about it. One of the damaging things about this case is that it's putting into sharper relief that policy, and it is forcing them to confront questions that they would just rather not
Yeah, they
confront.
don't want to be thinking
They
about
don't-
where the
they
money
don't
comes
want-
from right now.
Now
Yeah.
you've got people like us saying to them, well, do you think China's a threat or not?
Yeah.
And they have to end up, like Bridget Phillipson did with me in a different part of that interview, basically sort of talk out both sides of their mouths, which is to say, well, yeah, they're a security threat. But they're
that's
also
why
a tremendous economic
but that's why the
opportunity.
whole
Or which
evidence-
matters more?
Exactly. But they should never have gone. I mean, that's why I do think that this lawyer has a point. Don't go down the evidential route. Just say, if you don't think it's in the public interest to have the trial, just say it wasn't in the public interest. That's how they make things go away.
But isn't it possible to have a conversation where you say, yes, China is both an economic opportunity and a national security threat? I mean, a lot of countries
Yeah.
fall into that category. Not everyone just falls into a cuddly little ally.
I don't know. I think they're a category on their own. I don't.
Yes,
because
probably.
like if we
But
think
you
about,
can just deal with two people who are accused of spying. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a
Yeah.
crime.
And the
right?
fact is the
it
Chinese-
is a crime to spy on the UK state.
And what are the Chinese going to do? Pull all their investment and massive exports where they sell way more
They
to
don't
us
care
than
about
they do.
these kids. I mean,
You know,
I have to say, China is pretty cutthroat about this kind of stuff. I'm not sure that they would have. I don't even think these two would have been convicted, actually.
Well,
on
apparently
the
they told.
evidence.
I mean, they told Alicia Kearns, the security services apparently told Alicia Kearns, when she was, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, that it was a slam dunk case against them.
but I think the Chinese stuff does pose something that's relative. I can't really think of an equivalent because, other major geopolitical competitors in the past, or indeed today, let's say the Soviet Union, economically speaking, of no particular threat or
And
no,
the Soviet
and no
Union, there
opportunity.
was next to no trade.
And there was next to no trade because they were a hermetically sealed bubble. Russia today has ended up in that sort of, to a lesser extent, but in that sort of category as well. Other kind of authoritarian states, Iran or whatever, again, next to no trade. China is in this weird position. To some extent, we do have to look both ways because it is true that much of our modern economy, supply lines and go on, do run through Beijing and a ton of others deeply economically productive Chinese cities. And yet they also clearly pose a security and geopolitical threat. And the other thing I'd say is that obviously we can't just say it's not just China, right? If we're thinking about MPs, espionage for MPs, or kind of sort of wider kind of foreign influence operations, it's not just confined to China. And if we look at, it's a different sort of thing, but if we look at what happened with Nathan Gill, the former UKIP leader in Wales, long-standing sort of ally of Nigel Farage, he, of course, in February was charged by the Met under Counter-Terrorism Command with 8 counts of bribery and 1 count of conspiracy to bribery, allegations relating to payments made by him in return for promoting pro-Russian statements in the European Parliament and other media. And of course, just last month in September, on the 26th, he pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of bribery. So these kind of foreign influence operations, sometimes espionage, sometimes bribery, whatever it happens to be, they are becoming more and more frequent and a bigger and bigger part of our politics.
Yeah, and that led to the top of the party, Reform Party, pretending they didn't know him.
Yeah,
They've
bad
had
one, bad apple.
Yeah, don't bell.
Well, he's been in the barrel a long time.
Exactly.
And fresh advice from Dan Jarvis, the security minister, who went to the Commons and told people you need to be more careful about who you mix with.
Well, and just to say on that, I mean, that's an interesting thing about, we're looking ahead to the future and how foreign influence could become more and more important, something we have to think about more, which is, let's take Reform, just because they happen to be, obviously riding high and we're talking about them becoming a majority government, whatever, that would mean that you're going to end up with basically 350-ish sort of new MPs, potentially, from whom we've never heard. And we know that the vetting process for Farage's party outfits, he himself has said, it's not me saying it, he himself has said, has been rather lacking in the past. And it is difficult to do. It's genuinely difficult to do, to find 350 candidates, whatever it happens to be, 650 candidates altogether. And they would be, just like if there was to be a massive turnover, without those established kind of party networks which deal with these sorts of things, which the Labour and Tory parties have had for a long time. It's hard and would absolutely potentially be susceptible to foreign influence.
The guidance from MI5 I find really funny because yesterday they submitted new advice saying remain alert and trust your instincts. I would say don't trust your instincts. Remain alert and do due diligence on those people you're thinking
Trust
of
your
putting.
gut. I'll just go with your gut.
Trust your instincts. No, actually, just kind of do your homework.
you think they're a
Make sure
Chinese
you're
spy or
not
not?
appointing Chinese spies or Russian spies or people who want to ask questions on behalf of other authoritarian regimes into our world.
We'll be back after the break and the rise of the Green Party.
Some politicians seem confused. Do they serve the billionaires or do they serve you? I'm not confused. Ordinary people can't wait any longer. I'm here to make this call, but I can't do it alone. Will you stand with me? Let's bring back that feeling and make hope normal again.
That was Zach Polansky, leader of the Greens and one of the few politicians right now who has reasons to be cheerful in the post-conference YouGov polling bounce. Because what the public is telling us, which we all secretly know, is that conference season actually does sweet FA to a party.
Hang on, you like going to party conferences, and you're just now sitting here on our podcast and saying there's no point in going because they don't change anything.
I'm not saying there's no point in going, but I'm saying that it is this really strong reminder of what a bubble. You know, somebody once compared...
You're saying people don't listen to party conferences?
The Tory party conference to London Fashion Week. It's really, really important if you're in that bubble. And if you're not, you don't notice. Kemi Badenoch, with a, fairly well-received speech, lots of policies, lots of stamina, a few jokes, bit of charisma.
Great coverage.
Great
front pages.
At least for sort of, the first 12 hours, maybe 24 hours. She didn't really go anywhere in terms of the polling. Keir Starmer, likewise. But the one person who has seen a substantial jump is Zach Polansky on a personal level. And they have now reached, in membership terms, 100,000 members for the first time. That is near 50% rise since he took over as leader, about a month ago, just over a month ago.
Yeah, but look, Polansky's, he's been lighting up social media. He obviously won the Green Party leadership contest by an absolute landslide, hammered his opponents.
It was quite Putin-esque.
It almost was. You almost started to wonder about
the...
who were the people who voted against him? Because we're coming after you.
And he, since then, has been doing, I think, what was obvious for a while, which is that there has been a space in British politics on the kind of what you might say, the kind of populist, economically populist left. We actually did an episode on the show, about 6 months or so ago, basically asking why was it that the Green Party wasn't doing better? And there were sort of two reasons for that. One is that they were being led by some, nice people, one of whom we had Adrian Ramsey into the studio, but who seemed reluctant to engage in the kind of more pugnacious politics that characterises our age, and indeed the sort of more pugnacious social media sort of style. Polansky is not. And, the Green Party is a sort of weird creature because, on the one hand, it is sort of like there's sort of two wings to it. One is obviously the sort of environmental side, which is kind of like I always describe as like Lib Dems plus, radical green policies. So that's like kind of like very nice people and who sort of speak in very nice ways, who tend to do well in kind of more rural seats in the sort of more parts of deep England, the sort of places where the Lib Dems historically have done well. And there's always been a more economically, politically radical contingent, more hard left, more like the Jeremy Corbyn wing of the Labour Party. And what Polansky is doing is taking them hard in that direction.
I remember when we interviewed Polansky on the podcast, and we were saying, look, there is obviously a space on the left, but aren't you just going to be roadkill to Jeremy Corbyn's new party and Zara Sultana's new party, and they're just going to, eat you for lunch? And it looks like it's the other way around now. That the Corbyn, Sultana, your party kind of shenanigans are just so... They're kind of comedy in some ways.
Well, should we explain what? Because most people probably haven't.
Let's explain it. Sorry, yes, Lewis.
No, people who aren't as sad as us, John, like watching the kind of your party explain. Well, no, I was just saying that basically, Corbyn and Sultana, along with a clutch of other, some independent MPs and MPs who had been kicked out of the Labour Party, supposed to be forming their own party, which they decided would be called Your Party. Although even when they announced that Your Party was going to happen, Zara Sultana, the Coventry MP...
I don't think Your Party was even meant to be the name. They just had Your Party as a
holding
holding
party.
pattern. Yes, you decide what it's going to be called.
But Corbyn announced it, and then Sultana went on Twitter saying, no, we're not called Your Party. So from literally day one, it was clearly disputatious and fractious. And since then, got even worse when, for reasons that we probably don't need to get into, but basically it started to look like Sultana might end up suing Your Party or vice versa for the misuse of data and emails and all sorts of stuff. They seem to have made up a bit since then. They were in Liverpool at the weekend, announcing a rally. But the point is that they've been left behind by Polansky, as you say, John, because basically Polansky has won this election and is basically taking... The point is, what's the point of your party now? Because if you're talking about having an economically radical populist party of the left, that is now the Green Party. So what's your party's point?
So there's a really interesting conundrum for the Green Party now, which is all to do with how they raise party funding. And they have a ban on who they will accept money from. And this goes back to the point of what the party wants to be. So at the moment, they have a ban on accepting money from companies that market baby milk in developing countries, are involved in road building or intensive farming or meat sale. In other words, these go back to places where the Greens were just thinking about their sort of eco-populism, not about their economic populism. And I think Polanski is now coming to a place where, and others around him are saying, do we need to start to shift away from all the bans on where we get the money from?
He's barely been
Because
talking about climate change or green issues.
This,
He's
I
barely
mean,
been talking
what
about
he's done, and I think his model, as far as we can see, is a Mamdani-like
Exactly
character
right.
in New York, where the eco doesn't stand for ecology, it stands for economic. In other words, it's a tax the rich party, it's a socialist, it wears socialism on its sleeve, and it says, we will stop rip-off Britain. That's one of his phrases now. You know, he's made a very good fist of saying, all of you, you're getting ripped off, right? So there is a world in which he even appeals to kind of reform voters because what they care about most is being left behind, is being priced out, is the cost of living, all the rest of it. But they probably don't care about the ideologies of a Green Party that says no money from X, no money from Y. So I think that's going to be the next thing for Polanski now, decide, like, where are your green ideals now? Is it more important to just go left, get the money and enlarge?
Look, we have asked the question a number of times on the podcast, what presents the greatest threat to the Labour coalition of voters? Does it come from Labour voters switching to reform or Labour voters feeling disaffected and going to the left? And I think we now have a pretty clear answer, that there is a very substantial number of people who are attracted to this economic populism of Zach Polanski, which is much more kind of red in tooth and claw in terms of socialist values, than what is being offered currently by Keir Starmer. And if people feel that the Starmer project, and we've got the budget coming up, which will be grim, and all the rest of it, then yeah, Zach Polanski looks like a good harbour to shelter in for the time being. I mean, look, you know, the general elections are a long time away, and there's almost too much polling going on in this country at the moment, which is a whole separate argument. But I think that for the time being, who's had a bounce out of the party conferences? The Greens.
Yeah, the other complicated thing about Corbyn and Sultana working with the independents, the ones who were elected on the back of, not least really, the war in Gaza in 2024, is that they don't really share many of the same sort of
voting
traits.
against VAT on school fees.
Yeah, I mean, you can be, you know, one of the sort of Muslim independents who is not remotely progressive, probably doesn't have particularly progressive feelings on gay rights or LGBT rights or women's rights or any of that stuff. So then you've got very strange bedfellows for Corbyn and Sultana if they actually want to make that the basis for their next grouping.
But I think, you know, more broadly, I think it'd be really interesting to see not just what effect on British politics and the discourse, if Polanski can maintain this wave, has, but sort of on Labour, but also more generally. So because the truth is that, you know, what he's doing in one sense, it's like we said on that show at the time, it's not rocket science, right? What the left of politics has needed in Britain is to occupy that space, which has been vacant for a very long time, and you needed to do it pretty unapologetically, and you needed to do it with someone who kind of gets the modern media environment, gets the power of vertical video, gets, you know, is a competent speaker, all of which Polanski is.
That's
right?
no small thing. I mean,
Well, it's
you
no small
watch
thing,
him, but I'm serious. Like, you watch Polanski speak at the podium, and it sounds really obvious, but he rehearses his lines, he delivers his speech, he punches
He's
hard.
a good communicator.
No,
But most of them don't. I mean, the
Yeah.
incredible thing is that
Yeah.
most of them don't practice, you know, making a speech.
Complete. And so I'm not underestimating his ability, but more that the kind of like, it was kind of sort of obvious what
Yeah,
they
he
needed to
gets
do if
it.
they could get
Yeah.
the right. Exactly. But it's quite interesting to me just how much he's been hammered by reform related accounts, kind of the radical right, the online right. It's not the sort of Starmer left that have been going for him, or the Labour Party. It's these people, I think, who have been used to this idea for a long time that they themselves uniquely represent a kind of anti-establishment view, right? I think they dislike him perhaps most of all because in some ways he is playing on their territory, albeit from a very different sort of political vantage point. And if you
100%. This is like Bannon saying I share a lot
Yeah.
with Mamdani.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
the horseshoe comes round.
It does. And if you buy the theory, which I think we've talked about a lot, which that basically one of the reasons that British politics has been galloping hard, the Overton window has been moving hard in a right and radical right direction, is partly because it has been imbalanced. That the two magnetic poles, only one has been represented. And whether you agree with Polanski or not, and agree with all of his politics or not, you can think that it is important to have a different sort of view articulated from that side of politics, as effectively as some of the online radical right have been doing, because potentially it helps rebalance the scales a little bit in everyday media discourse, the day-to-day political conversation.
I mean, that was when we had Polanski on. The question we asked was, is left-wing populism the answer to right-wing populism? And I think what you see, and I remember it really clearly with the last German election, was the young women go hard left, the young men were going hard right, and the centre cannot hold.
Or W.B. Yeats there. Lovely to have him
Very
here.
good. I'm glad you got that reference.
Thank
in. We'll be back in just a moment. Donald Trump at Sharm el-Sheikh yesterday with the parade of leaders behind him who'd all flown in. And it was like they were the chorus line and there was only one actor who was the star in the show, of course, Donald Trump. And they were just kind of irrelevant people behind him.
I once stood on a stage with Donald Trump when he was the judge of his own beauty contest, Miss America, in Las Vegas. And it had that kind of feel to it. I mean, if they'd all been in sequin bikinis behind him,
What
it
an
wouldn't
image.
have felt any weirder.
Some of the interactions were absolutely special.
You go first.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm going to go for Keir Starmer, where he goes, "Where's the UK?" And Keir Starmer is like a kid at the back of the class who's about to say, "I want to go to the toilet," and he raises his hand. "Here I am," and he gets called in, and there's a bit of a hug and a bit of a chat, and then Keir Starmer's sent back again. You thought that Keir Starmer's moment had come and that he was going to address the world, and it was no, just wanted to see where Keir Starmer was.
The most revealing bit of it is when he talks about they were called here in 20 minutes, which obviously is not true. But that's
They were
what
waiting
appeals
about
to
6
him.
hours,
Yeah,
but
that's
yeah.
what appeals to him, right?
Like
They're
Saturday.
all just there,
I click my
click of a
actually-
finger, and they're all here to see the king of the world.
My
And in a sense
favourite
he
Where's
was.
Waldo? Gianni Infantini, head of FIFA. Right? What was he doing on that stage for world peace?
Good Lord. Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, if there was not a deal going on there when he arrived, there were definitely deals being made by the end.
I tell you what, the other person I felt most sorry for was Giorgia Meloni, who was told to stop smoking by President Erdogan.
Picture of health, of course.
Yeah, who looked.
Erdogan.
Yeah, exactly. And also, just the sexist way in which she was treated. "You're a very pretty lady. You're very beautiful." It's the beautiful Giorgia Meloni. Come on, guys.
Her face is a picture.
Being lectured on being woke by John Sopel. That really is the bottom of the barrel, isn't it?
Right, before we fall out kind of catastrophically in here, we'll say goodbye. Bye-bye.
See you
Bye for
tomorrow.
now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.